so glad that you've invited me here so that I can share some of the information that I've been researching over the last years, but with particular reference to India. So I think we all know when we look at the news at the moment that there's a lot of turbulence in the world, and the new president or the returning president of the United States is now using tariffs as a kind of foreign policy. When he doesn't like what another country is doing, he threatens to raise their tariffs. And what are tariffs? Tariffs is a tax on the border when you export something. Now, I want to talk about how traditionally trade policy was seen as very separate from foreign policy, but over the last years it's become a weapon of foreign policy, and this is what I'm going to talk about today, and how India can actually respond to these current challenges, because India is a very strong economic actor at the moment. So here I'm from Queen Mary University of London. In the heart of London, it's a very thriving and dynamic environment there. I hope that someday you'll come and join us or visit us to see what's going on. But the title of my presentation today is The World Trade Organization and Trade Agreements in Uncertain Times. And those uncertain times really at the moment revolve around the America First trade policy. We really were living in a period of globalization. I think everybody thought that countries were going to get closer and closer and more cooperation. And then suddenly the opposite has happened in the last year or so, in the United States particularly. And how is this affecting us? So I'm going to first of all talk about why we need trade law, international trade law. Then I'm going to talk about the challenges that we're facing. And then I'm going to talk about navigating these challenges. Now, international trade law, for those of you who don't know this, it's actually a part of public international law, and it's governed by those conventions such as the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, on how you actually interpret a law, how you look at it. It's customary international law that's been codified in many ways. So when you look at a legal text, do you look at it, how do you read it? Well, we look at the ordinary meaning of the text, and we look at the object and purpose of the treaty to try and define the meaning of these words that are put together sometimes 30, 40 years ago. How do we read these things? Now, trade law regulates the flow of goods and services between and across trade countries and regions. So, as you know, India is part of many trade agreements, such as the India-Singapore Trade Agreement, or the CEFTA, South Asian Free Trade Agreement. All of this we call international trade law, and it governs how you as consumers, as well as you as businesses, what you buy, whether the standard is, I don't know, whether the standard is this high or this high. This is all international trade law. So it's not just about that tax at the border, it also governs the packaging and the labeling on your products, and whether you can put a plug in a wall in this country in the same way that you can put the same plug in a wall somewhere else. So we have those regional and bilateral trade agreements, which India is very much signed up to, but then at the multilateral level, we have what we call the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, and the World Trade Organization, and that is really where I'm going to focus this discussion. Now, I'm going to read this out. This is by Ronald Coase, who was a very important economist and economic thinker. And he said, why do we need international laws to govern economic relations? Well, if it's supposed to be free trade, then why do we need law? Free trade should be free. Well, no, free trade is a theory, but we have laws because it is evident that, for their operation, markets require the establishment of legal rules governing the rights and duties of those carrying out those transactions. To realize all the gains of trade, there has to be a legal system and political order. Economic policy consists of choosing those legal rules, procedures and administrative structures which will maximize the value of production. So economic and trade law is really based in economic thinking, and it's supposed to harness the most that we can from doing trade. When two businesses trade, how can we do it in the most optimum way for consumers, as well as for the market, as well as for businesses? So that was back in the 90s, and that's the prevailing ideas. But we have economic theory, and I know many of you must love theory, so I just want to talk a little bit about the three main theories that underpin how we think about trade, and some of it will remind you of what's going on today. So the first theory I'm going to look at is mercantilism, then I'm going to look at free trade in terms of absolute advantage, and then comparative advantage. It's a very short discussion just to show you where the theory is that has constructed international trade law today. So mercantilism is a very old idea, and it underpinned colonialism and imperialism. It was the idea that you can't create wealth, you can only acquire it. Therefore, a big country, a powerful country, will go off to another country that's less powerful and extract. Some things we take for granted is that your government is rational and that you're not at war and that you will actually make good policies. But we take that for granted, it's not always there. So, okay, it was a revolutionary theory, it was very important, and it changed our way of looking at the world and of looking at trade, but it does have weaknesses. So then, somebody else came on the scene, someone called David Ricardo. I don't know if anybody's heard of David Ricardo here. He was kind of the one after Adam Smith. And he came up with, he said, let's not think about absolute advantage, because that means you have a specialization and I have a specialization and we can swap. He said, actually, we can all find a comparative advantage. Because, okay, for example, you might be able to do maths, you might be able to do law, you might be able to do sports, you might be able to paint. But if you look at how much effort you put into each one of those activities, there will be one that you're best at. And you should look at the one that you have a comparative advantage in. So yeah, sure, I could teach, or I could paint my house, but the best thing for me to do is to teach and then pay somebody else to paint my house. Even if I can do both of those things, because I have a comparative advantage in that. And that was revolutionary because it meant that all actors, at all times, can mutually benefit from cooperation and voluntary trade, even if they can produce all goods. So even if India can produce everything you could possibly want, it will still be better for India to focus, for example, now maybe it's on computing and AI, or maybe it's on some agricultural products. But there's no point in trying to make the chairs, the tables, the microphones, the water bottles, because you actually have a comparative advantage. And this meant that every country, even those countries which didn't seem to have anything, there was still something that they could do that was mutually beneficial to the world international market. Now, of course, there's problems with that. I'm not saying there isn't. It's a static model. For example, maybe I'm good at teaching today, but maybe next week I'm going to be really good at coding. And how do we work out this dynamic situation? Actually, and you also looked at the comparative advantage. You didn't look at those other issues. For example, yes, maybe I have lots of minerals in my country, but what about the cost of extracting all those minerals, and then maybe I have no minerals left, or cheap labor? China is dependent on cheap labor for quite a while to produce competitive products. It's no longer very cheap in China. They're having to move to Vietnam and Cambodia. So these things, you kind of exhaust some of your comparative advantage. So we know that there are problems with that. As time moves on, we become more sophisticated. But those ideas actually underpin what we call free trade. Free trade is a theory, and it's not that there's nothing regulating trade, there are no laws. Free trade promotes a mutually profitable division of labour, greatly enhances the potential real national product for all nations, and makes possible higher standards of living all over the globe. And a Nobel Prize winner, Samuelson, he did a lot of economic research, and he said, actually, you know, free trade is the best that we can have. It's the one that will make us all the boats will rise, the water level will rise for everybody. Now, I think we know as well that there are problems with free trade. For example, we see vast inequalities, even within our own countries, but also in the world. And we've had these organisations telling us that we're going to get richer and better, and actually only some people in some places have managed to do that. So it also ignores those costs, such as transportation costs, environmental costs. So we also know that that's not perfect, but it's like democracy. Democracy is not perfect. It sometimes kicks up bad results, or what we may consider to be bad results. But it's the best that we can find at the moment. It's the best system we have. And I think a lot of people still think about free trade in this way. So that theory of free trade has really been developed over centuries, since mercantilism. And this graph here shows you the evolution of trade and tariffs. And where the blue line goes down, it's been much more of a free trading era. And we can see that just before the Second World War, there were very high tariffs. And after the Second World War, there was a post-war, what we call liberalisation, and the tariffs came down. And here in 2016, we see them at one of the lowest points. So we know that before the Second World War, there were very high tariffs, and countries were trying to protect their economies, and actually it didn't do them any good. There was very high inflation, there was economic depressions, there was a lot of hardship, a lot of inflation, and people talk about this high protectionism led to a very bad social situation, which led to a lot of unrest with people, and that in itself led to extremist politics and war. And people always talk about, oh, the interwar period, it was terrible. Countries were trying to close down their borders, people got poorer, prices were really high, people couldn't afford to live. They started voting for very extreme politics to have a change, and we ended up with a world war that was extremely destructive all over the world. Now, so we came out of the Second World War, and there was a whole idea that we should start cooperating. We should stop with this protectionism. We should start trading with each other. We'll have peace through trade. If you and I trade together a lot, the chances of us going to war go down, because we've got a lot to lose by that. It would disrupt us. We saw what happened during COVID, how suddenly we couldn't trade with each other, and there was a lot of bad fallout from that, and there were a lot of supply chain problems. So this was the theory coming out of World War II. Free trade is an important mechanism for achieving world peace, prosperity, and security. And the US came out really behind this, was very much a supporter of free trade. And we should have multilateral organizations. So let's have a United Nations. And part of that was the Bretton Woods agreements. Now, I don't know if you've heard of the Bretton Woods agreements, but it was part of this consensus after World War II that we need to cooperate and we need to have international organizations and multilateralism. Now, first of all, there was this idea we'd have the International Trade Organization, which was going to be a big trade organization. However, even though the United States proposed multilateralism in the Bretton Woods, when it came to it, they didn't want the ITO, and instead we had the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, in 1947. And that was not an organization, it was a round of conferences and negotiations. It didn't even have a secretariat, and it didn't have a very strong dispute settlement mechanism. I'll just carry on. Oh, it is working. So there were some weaknesses with this institution. If you had a dispute, say for example, you and I have a dispute, we take it to the dispute settlement mechanism, the panel writes the report says that I'm in the wrong and you're in the right. Everybody had to agree to that panel. That's called negative consensus or positive consensus. So it's very difficult for us actually to have a panel settlement, because the loser will always say, I don't agree to the report. So there were these weaknesses in the GATT. So in 1995, the World Trade Organization was created. The World Trade Organization was supposed to bring in an established regime, a rules-based system, a rule book with a dispute settlement mechanism, and an appellate body to negotiate and administer these rules. And I think you can see by this graph here that so the red line is WTO, GATT WTO members as a percentage of world trade versus non-members as the blue line. And you can see from the 1940s that those governments that have joined the WTO have a much, much higher percentage of world trade than those who do not. So the theory bore out, actually. You will get richer, you will trade more if you join an international organisation with a rule book that you all agree to and that you can settle disputes. So the role of the WTO really is the only international organisation dealing with trade rules. Its functions are to administer those agreements. There's an agreement on trade, there's an agreement on services. I think a lot of you will know about the agreement on intellectual property rights. It's a forum for trade negotiations, it handles trade disputes, and it monitors national trade policies. And it has a beautiful building in Geneva on the side of the lake, and it has a secretariat to help governments. So it became a very established organisation. Now the role of the World Trade Organization is recognised not just by trade and economists and lawyers, but even under the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, under 17.10, trade to promote a universal, rules-based, open, non-discriminatory and equitable multilateral trading system under the World Trade Organization. And it's part of the UN system. So who trades? Well, trade is about consumption and selling. So you think of trade is about multinationals, businesses, consumers. Well, yes, all of these entities trade, but only governments can be member of the WTO. They're the only ones who have standing. They're the only ones who can go to the negotiations. They're the only ones who can bring a dispute. That's why we call it an intergovernmental organization. Now, so the governments come together and they negotiate rules, but those rules have to be agreed to by consensus. And you can imagine if just us here in this room tried to get an agreement on where we go for lunch tomorrow, it would take a very long time because there's so much diversity. Some people would say, I want to be vegan. Some people would say, no, I want the option of meat. Some people say, I want to go at 2 p.m. Some people say, I want to go at 1 p.m. So you can understand how it's very difficult among 166 different countries as far apart as Vanuatu and the United States and China to get an agreement. But the idea is they sit and they negotiate until they get consensus. And here's a picture of them negotiating. And it's very long-winded, it's very difficult for them to come to agreements because everybody is still thinking about their own best interests here because they respond to their electorate. Now the principles under the WTO, who knows what most favoured nation is? Does anybody know? If somebody can tell me, they get a prize.
Removal of tariffs. Removal of tariffs from the other countries.
A bit more than that?
So, basically, MFN says that if we have an agreement between the countries, then we would reduce the tariff to enhance trade further, and this would be done only if we have a very good, we have very good rapport or relationships than the other countries. So, this is particularly more on it's really two countries.
Not quite. But at the back?
All nations shall be treated equally.
Absolutely. Then is a core principle. If my best offer is to say 8% tariffs to you, I have to give that 8% tariff to everybody. I do not discriminate between my trading partners. The second core principle, national treatment. Who can tell me what national treatment is? Yes, at the back. Say that again?
The prices of imported goods have to be treated in similarity with the domestic goods.
So it means that we have MFN, where I can't discriminate between you, and national treatment, where I have to treat you the same as I treat my own. This is the core principles of non-discrimination. Because if you don't discriminate, you created a level playing field, you take the politics out of trade, and you get the gains from trade as much as you can. Then we also have, of course, these tariff concessions, I'm going to say any car that comes into my country has to pay, I don't know, 6% tariff. It's bound. You all know that. It's transparent, it's static. And then I don't change it because I don't like you one day, I like you the next day, and I don't charge. So that's a static principle. And then also I don't make restrictions. For example, I don't say, you can only sell your water in my country if you have a label that's more onerous than the label that I have for my own companies. So I don't make you do things more than my own countries, and I don't have import licenses. I don't say, okay, I'm only going to import 150,000 cars and you have to get a license. That's a quantitative restriction. And we see them in different ways. I don't know if you know about this carbon border adjustment mechanism the EU is talking about. Well, some people say that's a quantitative restriction. You're trying to say that you can only export into my country if you have the same emissions trading system as I do. So that's a quantitative restriction. Oh, it's subject to debate, but that is an idea. So those are the core principles we work with. And then the jewel in the crown, what they said was the jewel in the crown of the WTO was the dispute settlement mechanism. So here it's compulsory, it's exclusive, and it's very, very contentious. The objectives are really to provide security and predictability. So if we have a problem with MFN or national treatment or tariffs, we go to this dispute settlement body and they will adjudicate. They have a tribunal, they'll adjudicate it, and if you or I don't like the results, we can appeal it and we have an appellate body. So it's a very strong dispute settlement mechanism. There's no police that are going to come and put you in jail. It gives recommendations and it allows for countermeasures or retaliation. But it's all under a rules-based system, and it's supposed to take the politics out of trade and make it transparent, predictable and secure for us. Now, and also prompt settlement. This war is not going to carry on for ages and ages. Now the trouble is, since 2020 there's been a big crisis. This crisis actually started under Obama's regime, where he said, actually, we don't like the appellate body mechanism. We think that you're not just interpreting law, you're actually creating law. We think there is judicial activism going on, and that means that we've signed up to something that we didn't agree to. You're creating more out of what we agreed to, and we don't like it, and we don't like the fact that sometimes you tell us what to do. So the big guy on the block didn't like the fact that they were being told what to do, and yet they were also saying you're not doing it fast enough. You're taking too long over these disputes. And they're like 1,500 page dispute reports. It's very difficult for people to, it's transparent, but how do you get through that easily? So under Obama, they first started saying, we're going to veto the new members of the appellate body when it comes up to replace them. Now this has continued under Trump, and in 2020 there weren't enough appellate body members to actually be a functioning appellate body. So suddenly you can't appeal a report, or they call it appealing into the void. You can appeal it, but there's no appellate body to look at it, so your dispute actually hasn't closed. So they've tried to come up with other mechanisms. There's a legal route under Article 25 of the Dispute Settlement Understanding, and they've tried to come up with something called the Multi-Party Interim Appeal Arbitration Arrangement, MPIA. It's a workaround, it's a temporary fix. It's not really perfect because the US won't join up to it. I don't think India has joined up to it. So some countries, I think only 27 parties have joined up to this thing. It only looks at that dispute in question, so it doesn't create any predictability about how an interpretation will be. And it's only agreed to between the parties to the dispute. So, okay, it's a temporary fix, but it doesn't do what the appellate body did, which was to create a body of law which was predictable and transparent. So here is where we are. We're in a situation where we no longer have an appellate body, but we do have some temporary workarounds. Now that's not the only problem with the WTO that's been seen. So we know this contentious issue with the dispute settlement is the procedures. They're not doing it fast enough, and are they interpreting rules or are they making rules? Consensus decision making, as I said, among 166 countries, as varied as Burkina Faso and Russia, it's very hard to get consensus on anything unless you reduce it down to the lowest common denominator. So we have no rules on things like e-commerce, digital, environment, because there's not agreement. Now, the other big issue, which I think India has been very aware of and interested in, is this idea of who is a developing country. Now, this really kicked off because if you're a developing country or a least developed country, you can have special and differential treatment. And that means you can take longer to implement the rules, or maybe you have to do less obligations, or maybe you get some help trying to put the rules in place. Now, that's really important because when we have countries as diverse as Comoros and Japan, why would Comoros want to join this organization if it didn't recognize how poor and least developed Comoros is? Now, with least developed countries, it's not so contentious because there's an objective list that's been designed by the United Nations. So there are 45 least developed countries, and that's accepted. It's what is a developing country. And the United States says China is not a developing country. China is mega rich, it's one of the big global players. So who thinks that China is a developing country? Nobody here. Everybody thinks China's a developed country. Yeah? Who thinks?
Ma'am, as per my knowledge, recent report where I studied that their income level is very low, and
I think we forget that 30 years ago, China was a least developed country. It was poverty-stricken. It came out of lots of problems with politics, and I'm not going to talk about that now, but it rapidly developed very fast. And there are some parts, when we think of Shanghai or Beijing, of course we think, oh, this is very developed. But there's a lot of rural poverty, and there are a lot of people living under the poverty line. And so they say, hang on a sec, you can't tell us that we can't do things. We have to follow all these rules that America and European Union and Japan do. When it's only been 30 years that we've been actually doing this. Okay, we have some very strong statistics, but in other areas we do not at all. And I think it's the same criticism that Donald Trump places towards India. They say, oh, come on India, you're so rich, you don't need to be a developing country anymore.
Excuse me, ma'am. But if China says that it's not a developing country, but it in itself is not ready to accept any multinational companies or accept any other things. Like we have YouTube, we have Facebook, Instagram and all. But China is developing all its own apps. So when there is no connection with the outside world, how can it? No, obviously, it will not be called a developed country.
Well, we call them emerging economies, the BRICS. That's Brazil, India, China, South Africa, and I think Saudi Arabia is now one. And so we have new categories, it's much more nuanced. But at the moment, you can just say in the WTO, self-declaration, I am a developing country. And so during the trade facilitation agreement negotiations, for the first time, Kazakhstan decided it was a developing country so it could have some benefits. South Korea is still in some ways claiming it's a developing country. So it's a contentious issue. I'm not saying who's right and who's wrong here, but this is very much not black and white, and we don't have objective criteria in the same way we do for least developed countries. And the reason why that countries such as India say we have self-declaration is that they say, but that special and differential treatment, those privileges we're supposed to get, they're non-binding. Non-binding means it's up to the goodwill of a richer country to say, okay, you can have special treatment. They say, if you make that binding, and we can actually demand special treatment, then maybe we can talk about self-declaration. But at the moment, it's just this goodwill. We recognize developing countries need more support in joining the international trading system. Well, what does that mean? Does that put any butter on my bread? No. So So we have this discussion that's going on that's actually causing a kind of paralysis in the WTO. And of course, then along comes some big character like Donald Trump, and he says, the WTO is broken when the world's richest countries claim to be developing countries to avoid the rules and get special treatment. No more. Today, I directed the US Trade Representative to take action so that countries stop cheating the system at the expense of the USA. So he's coming out really hard on this one. His America First trade policy that's just come into place since he was inaugurated. Item K, the US Trade Representative, in consultation with the Senior Council for Trade and Manufacturing, shall review the impact of all trade agreements, including the World Trade Organization and the Government Procurement Agreement, on the volume of procurement covered by this order, and shall make recommendations to ensure that such agreements are being implemented in a manner that favours domestic workers and manufacturers, not foreign nations. So what does that violate? Which principle does that violate? Yeah, absolutely. Who said national treatment? So we're in a situation where Donald Trump wants to violate national treatment. He wants to violate MFN because he wants to favour some countries over another, and he wants a whole new world order in the first 100 days. So we're in quite a scary time, and India is not left out of this. I got this from the Economic Times. How can India dodge Donald Trump's tariff tantrum? Because in December 24, Donald Trump said India charges a lot of tariffs, reiterating his intention to impose reciprocal tariffs in retaliation for what New Delhi imposes on the import of certain American products. Now with Donald Trump in the White House, the threat of tariffs looms large over India. So he's already pointed out, the thing is, India has a trade surplus with the US. So the US is India, at the moment, the US is India's largest trading partner. India has a trade surplus. It exports 60 billion US value a year to the US, and it imports only 33.4 billion. So you could say, well, that's because India is competitive and India is doing well. Why punish somebody who's being competitive? But Donald Trump is saying, well, anybody who has a trade surplus with us, it's not fair, and we want to support American workers, American manufacturers, we want to buy national, give them subsidies. So he's overturning all of this theory that has been built up over centuries with very strong evidence based around it, not just politicians, it's been economists who've been working on these ideas. And the idea that we want stability and predictability and cooperation, because otherwise we end up having world wars. And he's just pushing the buttons of all of this. So what can India do? So the thing we have to remember is India is likely to increase its exports, its global exports. India is doing really well. So Modi, I think Donald Trump has said that he wants Modi to go over there and have a discussion with him. So Modi could go over and say, let's have sectorial negotiations. Let's talk about how India won't export so much of this. But again, from a World Trade Organization perspective, this is violating all the rules. You're supposed to negotiate in the WTO. You're not supposed to say, if you don't do that, I'm going to penalize you. It's supposed to be predictable and stable. India could make a mini trade deal. It has trade deals with Singapore, it has trade deals with different countries. It could have one with the US. The problem with trade deals is, yes, it means that you can do more than that's happening at the WTO, but ultimately it's more power-based than rules-based. So in this situation, Donald Trump will be saying, yeah, but this is not good enough for our people, so he's just pulled tariffs up to 25% against Canada. Canada now wants to retaliate. It's doing the same with Mexico, doing the same with China. China wants to dispute the WTO about this. So we're all going power-based, and you as lawyers, we like rules-based. We like to know what the book is and what you're supposed to do. And India could also say, well, look, the US has got so many problems with China at the moment. Actually, this is a good time for us because we've got many less problems with the US, and maybe we can take advantage of that. Or because India is increasing its share of global exports, India could also think, well, let's start looking at other trading partners. America is not the only game in town. We can think about the European Union, huge trade links with UAE, and also you have trade links with China. So maybe India should start thinking, well, maybe we should actually marginalize the US, not be so dependent on the US. If he's going to behave like this, the bully in the playground, maybe we don't want to play with him so much. And so maybe India is having to sort of reconfigure how its trade policy is, which is where you guys come in. Now, the great thing is, and I'm winding up here, the great thing is India is doing really well. Morgan Stanley says it's going to be the third largest economy in the world and stock market, and at the moment India is the blue line. So you're the first in terms of their currency index forecasting. So this is a really good time for India, and it's a really good time for India to have a rule book. And the rule book is actually in favour of India because it's saying don't discriminate between. It's trying to say let's bring down those tariffs, let's trade more, let's get more trade advantages from this. So maybe because India is doing so well, it's a time to say actually we need the WTO more than ever, because these rules are actually protecting people, countries that are profiting and gaining from the international trading system. You can see why a country like Burkina Faso might think, what is the point in the WTO? We don't export anything anyway. This is all about trade, and we don't do much trade. We're still quite subsistence. But India is doing a huge amount of trade. It's going to do even more trade. It's growing extremely fast, and it's going to be the third largest economy. So this is a really good time for India to think, well, actually the World Trade Organization supports us, because they're all about non-discrimination and bringing down these regulations. In the same way that China has said it's going to bring a dispute under the WTO against the US, it hasn't done what Trudeau and Canada or Mexico are doing, which is saying we're going to retaliate. They're saying, no, we're going to go to the rule book. The rule book says you're discriminating. You're discriminating most favoured nation, and you're discriminating national treatment, and you're raising your tariffs even though you set them at a certain rate. So maybe this is a really good time for India to come out and say, you know, do what you want to, America, but you're breaking the rules, and these are the rules, don't forget them. So my closing slide is, what does the WTO say about all of this? The WTO, the DG, suggests deep breaths and to chill over trade tensions. And ministers show the WTO support. And the point is, we need those rules. I think you know we need those rules. Even though it's not perfect, it's less imperfect than other rules. You need to know the rules, which means you have to know the WTO rule book, which is what China does back to front. I can honestly tell you, they know how to those rules and they know how to implement them and defend them. And you need to take action under the WTO and say we still believe in this system because it's the best system we have and it protects our interests. We're an exporting nation. We're going places. Don't suddenly tell us, after 200 or 300 years of you doing exactly what you wanted, that we can't abide by these rules because now you want to do exactly what you want to again. So that's where I'm finishing. Has anybody got any questions about that? What do you think India should do in this situation? Do you think the WTO, like Donald Trump, is broken? And it would be better for India to do what it wants with different trading partners, to violate this discrimination rules? I'm interested because you're the next generation. You're the ones who are going to be making policy and making laws. So what do you think? Please.
I just have a question. I wanted to know your views on India not joining the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. So isn't there no country that really wants free trade? Like India is not joining it. America is leading most free trade agreements now.
Well, America is not officially leaving them. It's just saying we're going to ignore the rules when we feel like it. If it left, then at least we would know what was going on there. But it hasn't left the USMCA. I think the thing that between China, that's a China thing, isn't it? India and China actually, a lot of people and a lot of economists think that India is actually going to take over from China now. China's had its time and it's not going to grow as fast. it also has to spend an awful lot of money suppressing its population because it's one-party rule. India doesn't. It's been a democracy for so long. It's used to this squabbling that goes on in a democracy. And India is now getting stronger and stronger. So it might be that in 10 years' time, India thinks that RCEP is a good idea for us. But trade agreements, they can offer an awful lot, but we know that they're selective. You join the RCEP and you're in this small gang, and at a certain point, the biggest one on the corner is starts telling everybody else what to do. The thing about the WTO is every member is equal. So nobody tells anybody what to do because it's consensus decision making. And there had been, I think 2004, there was a ministerial conference, negotiations going on and on. Kenya stood up and said, I'm not interested, walked out of the room. The ministerial conference was over. So it just takes one country to stand up and say, I'm not interested, and the whole thing shuts down. With regional trade agreements, you get much more politics involved. And with a dispute as well, say for example, you had a dispute, India was involved in the RCEP, and India had a dispute there, and it ruled against China. What is forcing China to observe the outcome of that dispute? Whereas in the WTO, you have this report, they say actually you can retaliate, these are the measures you can take, it has to be proportionate. So there are a lot of, there's a lot to be said for having one rule book. But obviously we know that because decision making is so slow in the WTO, and we do want to have agreements on things like e-commerce, and we do want to talk about things like state-owned enterprises, that regional trade agreements are the obvious forum for that. Any questions? So there's an economic and there's a legal response to this. The economic response is that economists think if you say that we don't have any, we're all under one rule book, then India wants to buy something. Say India wants to buy some commodity. The cheapest place to get that could be Oman. So it thinks, okay, I'm going to buy this from Oman. Now, if India goes into a trade agreement such as South Asian Free Trade Agreement, and they bring tariffs down completely, Oman is no longer the competitive one, it could be Sri Lanka. Now, for economists, that's called trade diversion. It means that if you go to the shops, you would normally go to the most competitive shop to buy your stuff. But if suddenly it was easier for you to go to another set of shops, you wouldn't go to the one that was actually the most competitive, you'd buy it somewhere else, even though it wasn't as competitive. Even though Sri Lanka is not as good as Oman in this case, suddenly the trade agreement has made it look as though it's more competitive. So we call that trade diversion. So from an economic point of view, the WTO doesn't like trade agreements so much because they create trade diversion. You're not going to be getting it from the most competitive, the best seller, because it's distorted. From a legal point of view, they think, well, this is creating a spaghetti bowl. So are we trading under the WTO? Are we trading under SAFTA? Are we trading under RCEP? From a legal point of view, this is becoming really complicated, and the whole point of having one rule book is that we all follow the same book. So what they do is that they have a rule called Article 24, and Article 24 is supposed to govern regional trade agreements. It's supposed to be substantially all trade. It's not allowed to raise barriers to non-parties. So when you go into SAFTA, you can't make it more difficult for other countries. It's supposed to be liberalizing. And they say, we recognize that trade liberalization is good. So we can't stop this. We think it's good because they're trade liberalizing. But do it on substantially all of your stuff. Don't just make it about one commodity or one good. Do it in a reasonable period of time, and don't harm non-parties. So it's there was a whole discussion a while back, are they stumbling stones or are they like a building block? Because what you discuss and negotiate in a regional trade agreement could eventually become a multilateral. So if we start looking at e-commerce in regional trade agreements, we're kind of like working out what's best, and maybe the best outcome from those negotiations at some point we can all agree on and take them into the WTO. So it could be a building block. others say, well listen, as soon as you start having this trade diversion and this spaghetti bowl, then it's a stumbling block, not a building block. But it's contentious, there's no right or wrong answers in this world, unfortunately. Any other questions?
Thank you for the information so far.
My question lies on the recent warning to BRICS by Donald Trump, saying if they try to find an alternative currency than US dollar for the BRICS trade, then he would impose tariffs on these countries as well. So, two-parted question. First one is, since World War, USD has been the most traded currency, and how was that determined, and how is it still the most traded currency? And second, what is the negative impact to US if BRICS start to use their own currency?
Well, first of all, do you think nowadays the US, that the dollar is king? Do you still think it's king?
I mean, no one country can take on US by itself. That's what I feel. US is not the king, but you need a coalition of at least, let's take BRICS to take on US alone.
Well, we would hope that this would be the new world order is actually not Donald Trump shaping the world, but it's actually countries that are now growing and emerging, that have been historically sort of put upon under colonialism, and actually now it's their time. So, but this is a very political answer, isn't it? And currencies, you know, I can say, look, I think it's good that we have multiple strong currencies and then we can choose and they compete, and if you want to invest in a currency, it's not all about the dollar, and then if something happens to the dollar, we're all scared. So in my way, I think it's good that you have many strong currencies, but I also like the idea that those big countries can start shaping the world after centuries of people telling them what the world is. So why shouldn't Brazil, India, Russia, China and South Africa and maybe Saudi actually start saying, we are big countries, we are important countries, and we therefore should be shaping the narrative of the next century, 2 centuries. Of course, anybody who's been in control doesn't like losing power, and I think a lot of this is about the fact that in the same way that England couldn't handle loss of empire, America can no longer handle the idea that it's not going to be number one. It's painful, it's very difficult for somebody to step down, they're no longer, but it happens, even in sports. Somebody's the reigning athlete for 5-6 years, and then somebody else comes up. That is life, and unfortunately Donald Trump is not going out quietly.
Yeah, that definitely looks like the reason he came back in.
Yeah.
But so when Britain was there, if you had asked me the same question, I would say America was the number 1 country. Now it's no longer. But since Donald Trump, sir, came back with the vision, make America great again, and the decisions he's taken since the days he's taken observed office, it's actually it's like a direct finger towards the other countries.
Yeah, and I think it's not only on a global level. I think also within the country, white America is scared because they're no longer the majority. You know, Hispanics, non-whites, blacks, they're numerically they're stronger, and I think white America is scared. So we have to be understanding about scared people. They behave irrationally.
Noted. Thank you.
So if we any more questions, or maybe we ready? It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much.